Welcome everybody to the fourth annual Jess Nieto Memorial Conference at Bakersfield College. This conference celebrates the legacy of Jesus Gilberto Nieto, or Jess, as he was known by all. We're here to celebrate academic life at Bakersfield College, the arts, scholarship, culture, Chicano studies. These topics are all relevant to the San Joaquin Valley and are all things that Jess cared deeply about. Over the course of the next 3 days, the Bakersfield College Social Justice Institute will host 5 additional virtual panel events, including tonight's event, with artists, professors, student leaders, young and upcoming scholars, photographers, and filmmakers, all celebrating the rich cultural legacies of the San Joaquin Valley. Check out the virtual events at the conference page for the BC Social Justice Institute webpage. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to give a few acknowledgements and a quick overview of the format for tonight's event. In terms of our format, our speaker will talk anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes, depending upon how much he has to say. Thereafter, we'll have a Q&A session, which I'll moderate. If you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box. You're also welcome to blow up the chat, but if you have a question for the speaker, please make sure to drop that in the Q&A box so we can make sure that we get to it. Also, again, to acknowledge Professor Brian Russell from our philosophy department. Andrew Bond has promised that he will cue you in so you can ask your question live. I also want to give a big shout out to all the folks at BC Events Services, especially Leah Prendez for making tonight's webinar happen. Again, I want to also thank my comrade in all things social justice at BC, Professor of English Andrew Bond, for holding down all the tech tonight and through the entire conference. The organizers also asked that everyone join in acknowledging the Chumash peoples, the Yokuts peoples, the Kumeyaay Nation, and their elders, both past and present, as well as their future generations. We want to take this opportunity for all of us to reflect on how we work here today in our search for knowledge, our opportunities to teach, and every day in our chosen fields affects these lands and the peoples of these lands that we work with and research to protect. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Manuel Vargas is professor of philosophy at UC San Diego, where he writes and teaches courses on moral psychology, free will, and the history of philosophy in Latin America. He has published more than 60 articles and has authored several books, including Building Better Beings, a Theory of Moral Responsibility, which won the 2015 American Philosophical Association's Book Prize for the best book in philosophy written by a young scholar. Professor Vargas will talk tonight about his trajectory and his career from BC from BC to UC San Diego and his evolution of his work and in view of philosophy. Please join me in giving a big virtual welcome to Professor Manuel Vargas.
Well, thanks so much for having me here. Am I audible? I want to make sure that I can be heard. Okay, so I just want to thank Oliver and Andrew and the BC community really for having me here. It's a huge pleasure and honor to get to do this. Jess was a really kind of important figure in my life. And so I'm delighted to have an opportunity to talk about some of the kinds of things that Jess was very interested in. And hopefully you'll be interested too in some of the story here that I'm going to be telling. So, I think a natural thing for you to be wondering right now is something like, what are we doing here? What is this talk about? Why are you hearing me talk about these things? And the organizers, Oliver and Andrew, asked me to talk about 2, as it's going to turn out, interrelated themes. So one is just my higher education journey. That is, as Oliver said, how I went from BC to where I am now. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the kinds of things that I do scholarship on, that I teach and that I write about, because both of these things are, for me anyway, very interconnected. And anyway, you can't give a professor a forum to talk in without it turning out that you're going to get a lecture. So too bad for you if you're here. You're going to learn a little bit about Mexican philosophy along the way. Among the things I'm going to try to talk a little bit about are about diverse paths in education, about making your own way, about the history of Mexican philosophy, the importance of Bakersfield College in particular, and hopefully I'm going to give you a relatively concrete, as it were, real world philosophy puzzle about the possibility of free will. So I'm going to try to do all of that in the next 40 minutes or so. We'll see how it goes. But thanks for bearing with me. So partly I want to start this, and I'm going to end this with a story that is from and about Bakersfield. There are a lot of stops in between, But first, before I tell that story about Bakersfield, what I want to do is take a moment to talk a little bit about the brief history of Mexican philosophy at Bakersfield College. So way back in 1975, Dr. Jess Nieto, for whom this conference is named, was in the early days of starting the Chicano Studies program at Bakersfield College. And among the courses he thought it would be important to have was a class on Mexican philosophy. There weren't any standard textbooks back then to use to teach this sort of thing, but Jess, David Rosales, and their team compiled hundreds and hundreds of pages of source material to create this 2-volume source book that you see photographed there on Mexican and Chicano thought and philosophy. And from that source book that they put together, there was a class on Mexican philosophy that was taught at Bakersfield College for several years. And you can see the syllabus there on the right-hand side. That's philosophy 35, as it was way back when, on Mexican philosophy. And one of the things that's really interesting, if you take a look, or at least for those of us who are contemporary historians of Mexican philosophy, and I think we may have a couple here in our audience, I'll just mention that one of the things that's interesting is who's thanked in the opening of the anthology. So among those folks who played a role in constructing this source book were Jorge Cabrera, the librarian at the UNAM's Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, the Research Institute for Philosophy at the UNAM, and Ernesto Sosa of Brown University, who's today a hugely famous, distinguished senior figure in philosophy, but who back in 1975 was at the very beginning stages of his career. And so he too had a kind of hand in the study of Mexican philosophy here at Bakersfield College. So all of this is to say that this talk, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about Mexican philosophy, is neither the first nor, I suspect, the last talk on Mexican philosophy to be given at Bakersfield College. All right, so I've been asked to talk a little bit about myself. That's always a dangerous thing. The temptation for academics to talk about themselves, and maybe me in particular, is terrible. But that's the invitation that I got, so that's what you're going to hear a little bit about. So a little bit of context, because all of us come from somewhere. We're all shaped by forces that stretch back to times and places somewhere else. And so I want to spend a little bit, before I get to the schooling part, a little bit just kind of gesturing very briefly, and really too briefly, at some of my family context. So my father is from a small town in Guerrero, Mexico, and his father was a native Nahuatl speaker for whom education was a kind of promise for financial security for his children. And my father came to the United States to finish his education, and it was here that he met my mother. And she's from Sacramento, and her family story in the US is a very long one. It dates back to before the United States even existed as a country. And it was her educational path from a community college in Sacramento to UC Davis that in many ways became the template for what I ended up doing. But first they had to meet, and then they had to decide to live in Bakersfield. And of course, that was the situation that I was born into. And so I grew up here on the east side of town. I've got a brother and sister whom some of you know, and Elena and Andres. And I attended Longfellow. I went to College Heights. Incidentally, this is where Earl Warren, the Supreme Court Justice, he went to College Heights and in Washington Junior High, I believe, or at least Washington Junior High here in Bakersfield. And then I went to East Bakersfield High School, which is there on the slide, and then eventually to Bakersfield College. And one of the things I want to note here along the way is that by reputation, many of these places were supposedly terrible places to get an education. But one of the things I found out very early on in my time here in Bakersfield was that oftentimes reputation is a terrible guide to the kind of education that you can get. I frequently received a terrific amount of effort on the part of teachers in the teaching of their classes and got a tremendous education, in part because of teachers investing huge amounts of resources into the teaching of their classes. And so I do think there are always going to be challenges for effectively delivering public education at scale. But there are always going to be dedicated teachers and activists and people who are invested in their communities who make a lot of these places way more spectacular places to learn than reputation would end up conveying. And so I think if you pay attention, you're able to carve out some time to focus, you have some opportunity, there's oftentimes a respectable education to be had, even in places that by reputation aren't super fantastic. At the same time, I think I was very lucky, not just to have great teachers, but to have parents who cared about education. So I was lucky to have teachers and parents who challenged me. I was lucky to live in California, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But I also grew up in an environment where the idea that people of Latin American descent regularly made important cultural contributions was relatively familiar. And some of that, of course, I put on my parents, and some of that I put on Jess Nieto. And I think there's this kind of important thing about a lot of times people's sense about what they can do with their lives is a function of what they see around them demonstrated. So I was very lucky. As a child, my parents took me to Mexico City a number of times. I got to see this massive city, museums, art, and all of its contradictions in person. But some of it was also here in Bakersfield, seeing Jess and his activism and Chicano studies and all the Latin American music and art and the richness of the diverse cultures in Latin America were all part of the vibe and in the background growing up in a way that I didn't quite realize how distinctive it was until later on when I was living away from some of these sorts of things. So that's how it all started. And here's where things kind of have ended up. So today, as you know, I'm a professor of philosophy at UC San Diego. Most of my teaching and writing is about free will, moral responsibility, and Mexican philosophy. I'm a faculty member affiliated in Chicanx and Latinx Studies, Latin American Studies, International Studies. I'm a member of the UCSD Institute for Practical Ethics and the Chapman Brain Institute Neurophilosophy of Free Will project. And I've written some things, but maybe the thing I'm most proud of recently was a project that was called the Latin Free Will Agency and Responsibility Project that I co-directed with a colleague in Colombia in Latin America. And it was so far as I know, the largest internationally funded project to spur the development of philosophy in Latin America, particularly focused on questions about free will, agency, and moral responsibility. And so this was a project that spanned several years. COVID kind of made things a little complicated. I'm happy to talk a little bit about that if folks are interested in the Q&A. But it's one of these things that I think that much of contemporary philosophy ends up being, as it were, separated by language and borders. And this project was one effort at trying to bridge some of those borders in a tangible way. Okay, so this is kind of what I've been up to over the past few years, some of the things here. But there's the question about how we get from East Bakersfield to UC San Diego and my particular path for doing that. So here's a story about how I got, or how I got from one place to the next and the stops along the way. So as you know, I started here at Bakersfield College. I stumbled into some philosophy classes, partly just fulfilling general education requirements and partly vaguely curious about these things. I had a high school teacher who taught a little bit of philosophy in his literature class, George Mawson, and I was really interested in maybe exploring a little more. So I took a couple philosophy classes, and I was excited to find professors like Moya Kinchlet, David Ray, Jack Hernandez, who were talking about arguments and ideas in their classrooms as though they mattered. And this was super exciting to me. That is the idea that ideas could matter, that arguments could be better and worse. And it was not enough to write well in their classes. You had to show why the arguments got you from what you might have wanted to believe to what you could show was reasonable or plausible. And after about a year of taking a number of philosophy classes, I thought, well, this seems like a pretty good path. I like these classes. This is a lot of fun. I'm learning a ton. And so I became a philosophy major. And then in my second year at Bakersfield College, I decided to join the local debate team because the idea that I could do arguing for sport seemed like a tremendously exciting thing to do a bit of. So Bob Leatrick was running the program at the time. And while I was at BC, I was working at a now closed pie shop on the east side. So some of you who are from Bakersfield or been around for a long time may remember Fontana Pies. Spent many summers, well, not that many, 2 or 3 summers, shoveling pies in and out of ovens for them while going to college. And after my 2 years at Bakersfield College, I then transferred to the University of California at Davis, which is where my mother had gone to school, which was part of the appeal. It was a place that was in Northern California. We had some family in Northern California. And I thought, okay, this is going away from home, but I'm still in the Central Valley. I can still get back home. And it seemed like a great place to go. So after Bakersfield College, I did my 2 years there. I headed out to UC Davis. So this is a building that houses the philosophy department in it at Davis. Locally at the time this building was built, everyone was calling it the Death Star. And I think you can imagine why. But at Davis, what I did is I continued to be a philosophy major. I had had a wonderful experience being a philosophy major at Bakersfield College, and I carried that inspiration with me off to Davis and effectively took every single class I could have taken at Davis in the 2 years I was there that were in philosophy. And a lot of times I was taking classes outside of the philosophy department that ended up being de facto philosophy classes, so intellectual history classes, political theory classes. And folks like David Kopp and G.J. Maddie and Phil Clark, who were in the philosophy department there at Davis at the time, encouraged me to think about graduate school. And I didn't want to tell them that I couldn't imagine going to graduate school for two different reasons. So one is I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. I was going to be an attorney, and I didn't know why I wanted to be an attorney. It just sort of felt like the kind of thing that one should do if you wanted some financial security. And I thought, okay, I like arguing, so let's go be an attorney. But the second reason why I didn't want to talk about this was about the possibility of going to graduate school in philosophy. So I just thought, like, I could never afford to do this. What are you supposed to do when you're done being going to graduate school in philosophy? Only a total idiot would spend their life doing philosophy. So naturally, I ended up becoming that idiot. But one of the important things that they told me was that that if you do graduate school right, you can effectively get paid to get a graduate degree. And this was a kind of crucial moment. So I thought, well, wait a minute. So I can, TA and maybe get some grants and cobble the money together. And at the end of 5 or 6 or 7 years, or however long the PhD program was going to end up being, I would have a degree, and I would have spent a few years getting to think really hard about some of the most interesting, fascinating questions that there are out there. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll go to graduate school in philosophy until I decide it's time to go to law school. And so here I am, many decades later, any day now, ready to go off to law school. From Davis, I applied to a bunch of different graduate programs in philosophy, and I really wanted to go to UC San Diego. I thought that'd be a terrific place to study, and I was rejected. I didn't get into UC San Diego. Weirdly, years later, as I was moving to UCSD to take the job there, I discovered in a bin the only rejection letter I had saved from my graduate school days. And I have no idea, I think it was an accident that was even saved. My rejection letter from UC San Diego, which now sits on the wall in my office at UCSD. So sometimes things work out in really funny ways. From Davis, I ended up getting into the graduate program at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. And I spent a year there, and it was a beautiful place. The campus was gorgeous. It was a huge philosophy department. Lots of interesting philosophy was going down. But there were two serious downsides so far as I could tell. First of all, it was really, really cold. I had no idea what a real winter is like. And if you've grown up in Bakersfield or spent most of your life in Bakersfield, you have no idea what winter is. Northern Indiana has real winters, as I discovered, and that was a shock to me. But the second thing that mattered a great deal to me was that they had a terribly, terribly low tortillas per square mile count. And again, this was something that you can't see in advance, but I experienced culture shock for the first time in my life when I moved out to Northern Indiana, in the sense that there was a sense of kind of cultural disorientation that partly came from a lack of the kinds of things that had been very familiar to me growing up in Bakersfield and spending time in and around California and Southern California in particular. So I learned a lot while I was there, but there was also a really pivotal experience that I had while I was at Notre Dame that I think I'll spend a couple seconds telling you a little bit about, because it played a really kind of formative role in my intellectual trajectory afterwards. So at Notre Dame, there was a requirement for the PhD where you had to be able to read in 2 foreign languages. And so I went in to meet with the director of graduate studies. And I said, I'm trying to figure out what I want to do for my other foreign language. And he paused and stopped me. And he said, "What do you mean your other foreign language?" I said, "Oh, well, I was figuring I would use Spanish as one of my foreign languages. And then I just have to figure out what the other one's going to be." And he frowned and kind of shook his head, and he said, "Well, yeah, but you can't use Spanish as one of your foreign languages." I said, well, why not? And he said, "Well, it's not one of the philosophical languages." Now, at this point, I had no idea what he meant, and it wasn't clear to me why he was saying this. And so I asked him to explain. He said, "Well, look, there's been no important or significant philosophy that's ever been written in Spanish." And I was confused. I was like, so Spanish is a widely spoken language. It's the dominant language in large parts of the world. There's a long history of people thinking in Spanish and writing in Spanish. How could it be that no one had ever done any philosophy in Spanish or done any important philosophy in Spanish? And this just seemed really baffling to me. And so we went back and forth about it. And eventually the agreement was that if I could show that I was going to use Spanish for my PhD research, that I would be allowed to count Spanish as one of my foreign languages. And of course, I decided I would accept this offer because, the best offer I could get. But I left his office saying, look, I want to know that I'm the first person in the history of the program here who's had to show that whatever languages I'm picking, I'm actually using for my PhD research. And that was something that that nobody else, so far as I could tell, had to do. And so there was this kind of special burden here. But part of what was really important to me, and here I don't really fault the director of graduate studies because he was just doing his job. These were the ways in which people at the time thought about these things. And it was there was presumably a prejudice he'd inherited from his own teachers and from the construction of what counts as central and peripheral in the philosophy world at the time at which he was trained. And so for my purposes, part of what was really important about this, though, was that it really motivated me to take seriously the idea and the kind of question about, was there any philosophy that had been produced in Spanish? And if so, what was it? Or was it any good? Or is it interesting? And so when I left Notre Dame a year later, I took with me that interest in thinking about the philosophy in Spanish, and it was what sparked my interest and pursuit in thinking a little bit about the history of philosophy in Latin America. And along the way, I reached out and sent emails to philosophers, including Ernie Sosa, who I mentioned at the outset, and Jorge Gracia, who began to set me down the path of thinking about and reading and learning about some philosophy that was written outside of the Anglophone world. Okay, so I left Notre Dame and I decided to solve the problem of bad weather and went to Stanford University and ended up getting my PhD from there. So Stanford was great. There were a lot of people around the campus. You could learn about nearly anything. And part of what I liked about the department was that so long as I did what I was required to do in the department, there was a complete indifference about whether or not I was doing anything else. And so for my purposes, this is fantastic. Benign neglect is one of the best things that you can give somebody who's motivated about their own education. And in my case, part of the way that the benign neglect manifested is I was taking a bunch of classes over in Latin American studies, taking intellectual history courses on the history of Latin America. I was taking classes in the comp lit department. I was even taking classes like soccer and Latin American dance and fencing and all kinds of crazy stuff because I was at this enormous university that had just a ton of different kinds of things. And it felt like, well, this is my one chance to do it. Because when I'm 50, I'm not going to be able to take random classes on things and learn about all sorts of whatever happens to grab my attention in the same kind of way. And so I did that. And I also enrolled in a joint PhD program while I was there. So I had to do a couple extra years of coursework, but interdisciplinary coursework across the humanities. But I ended up doing a joint PhD in philosophy and humanities while I was there. And one of the things that was really important to me in my experience at Stanford was that that I didn't want to leave opportunities and resources on the table, as it were. So Latin American studies, they had these scholarships you could apply for, these grants you could apply for, where if you got them, it would allow you to spend time studying in Latin America. And so I spent a couple of summers on grant funding from the Center for Latin American Studies, going to Mexico and spending time at the Research Institute of Philosophy at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and brushing up on my greatly decayed language skills, and came to develop what academics would call an area of concentration in the history of philosophy in Latin America. And it was at Stanford, I think in the year before, maybe the year after I got my PhD, that I taught my first Latin American philosophy course. And so I did that for a while. But maybe the most important thing that happened while I was at Stanford was I eventually met and married my spouse. But I'm not going to tell you about all of that part of the story. So eventually I got my PhD and I applied for jobs all over the country. And this is one of the things about that's very distinctive about academic life, is that after you get a PhD and you go on the job market, or you're ready to go on the job market before PhD, that people do it different ways, you don't have a lot of control about where job opportunities pop up. And so especially in small fields like philosophy, it might be that there are no jobs in some states in a given year. And there might be, 2 or 3 jobs in a state in a given year, but there's no guarantee about that those jobs are going to be in areas that you work in. And so it's a kind of, hoping for the best. You get your degree, and it could be that you aren't able to get a job right away, or you have to be on the job market several years, or that if you do get a job, you could end up with a job in a state you've never visited before, in a community very much unlike the one that you grew up in or have spent time in. And so it's a little unpredictable. And so my spouse and I, we were ready to go. We'd steeled ourselves for the possibility that we were going to go on a great adventure, and we were going to move across the country. And what ended up happening is I ended up getting a job offer a few miles away from where I was doing graduate school, and I took a job at the University of San Francisco. San Francisco was my home base for about 15 years or so. And one of the great things about San Francisco is that it's a place that takes philosophy. The University of San Francisco takes philosophy very seriously. They had a good-sized philosophy department. It was required of everybody at the university, and it was a really kind of diverse, intellectually diverse department in a lot of ways. But for my purposes, one of the really special things about the University of San Francisco was that they were incredibly tolerant of my coming and going. So they were willing to let me go and visit other places and come back. And so so we did for a number of years. So I spent a year at Caltech, where I was trying to teach free will to physicists and engineers. And it turns out that students at Caltech are great students, although they have a tendency to try to turn everything into an engineering problem. So it was a kind of very distinctive experience teaching these subjects to students who've been trained up in physics and engineering, and they approached it a very different way than students at USF. And a few years later, I was a visitor at UC Berkeley for a while, and off and on over a couple of years, I taught courses at Berkeley. And then in about 2009, I spent a year out visiting at Harvard, supposedly to write this book, Building Better Beings. It turned out I didn't get a whole lot of writing done that year, but I had the good fortune of being able to spend the year after at the Center for Ethics at Stanford University, where I did, in fact, end up writing the book that I had projected that I was going to try to write at Harvard. Eventually I was persuaded. Oh, actually, a quick note about this. So the Building Better Beings eventually was written and published. The cover you can see there, on that cover, there's a detail of a mural. That mural you can find in Los Angeles. It was painted by a cousin of my spouse, the artist Aaron Noble, and he and this is a kind of an image of a cosmic border crosser, and that sort of space egg thing there in the middle of the image. There is a Nahuatl pictogram in it that is in it, and so this is a kind of representation of border crossing. And so anyway, so that ended up being a background image on the book. So eventually, I was persuaded to leave the Bay Area to go and take the job that I now have at UC San Diego, where the department was building out some strength in a number of areas that I was interested in. And over the past 5 years, we've done a lot of really interesting things in the philosophy department there. But one of the things I'm maybe most proud of is the expansion of our course offerings to include courses in Mexican philosophy, Latinx philosophy, and Latin American philosophy. We also started the Mexican Philosophy Lab, which is a group of faculty and graduate students doing research on Mexican philosophy, including translation work, original research, and organization of conferences. And bracketing the pandemic, a lot of my professional life has consisted in reading and writing. I mean, this is what philosophers do. We read, write, we teach the classes, and then giving talks wherever people will put up with me talking at them. So sometimes this has meant traveling, so going to places like Mexico, Colombia, Canada, Germany, Sweden, Portugal, Spain, lots of other places. And sometimes, it involves hosting things and bringing in really smart, interesting folks, some of whom I think are here in the audience, to come in and teach the community where you are. And I continue to teach courses that connect to my research interests. So classes on free will, moral psychology, and of course, the history of Mexican philosophy. and many of the graduate students I work with have interests in overlapping topics. The work is challenging. It's always challenging, and it's massively time consuming. It's very difficult to do research work and have lots of spare time on your hands, but it's also super rewarding. It's really rewarding to get to work with a community of smart, thoughtful people who are trying to build a conversation and who are trying to change the way in which we think about issues in the world and think about how education is structured. And it's always terrific to work with really motivated students. And so for all these reasons, UCSD has been a really kind of happy home for me in a lot of different ways. Looking back, I'm struck by, as I think about my own kind of intellectual trajectory in this way, I'm struck by how much of my life was shaped by a thing that I think of as roughly the California advantage. So I think one of the things that's distinctive and really amazing about California's public education system is the mesh of opportunities. So you've got your community colleges, which more than any place, I think, really any place in the country, embody the ideal that higher education ought to be open to everybody. And you've got your Cal States, which provide degrees for huge swaths of the state. And then you have your research-focused universities, i.e. the UC system. And I think compared to a lot of other states, which have increasingly walked away from the idea that their citizens should have access to world-class education, California's held on, more or less. Things are, of course, more expensive than they should be. And as a state, we continue to prefer to build prisons over colleges and universities. But our public higher education system, I think, remains one of the best in the world. And several pathways to completing your higher education system are available to everybody who lives in this state for any significant amount of time. You can get your a world-class education here much more cheaply than you can nearly anywhere else. And I think this makes a tangible difference in a lot of very real ways. I think my own trajectory through higher education was very much marked by this. And I think, you know, look, the more you complete your education, the more you're going to make monetarily, and the less likely you are to suffer from things like unemployment. As it turns out, you know, bachelor's degrees are worth about $25,000 a year for the rest of your life over a high school diploma. But social scientists say that the advantages end up being much more diverse. Generally speaking, more education means better health, more longevity, more stable relationships, and a greater sense of well-being. So I think there's a lot of reasons why we as a community, we as a society, we as a state ought to be really invested in higher education. And I think part of what's terrific about the kind of arrangement of things here in California is that we have exactly that. But here's the big dirty secret in American higher education. And the secret is this: although it is true that higher education's got all these advantages I was just gesturing at, a lot of colleges and universities just end up reproducing what social scientists call social stratification. That is, what social class you end up in after your education is over is partly dependent on what kind of college you went to. And what kind of college you went to is a function of how rich your parents are, right? This is the dirty secret. The dirty secret of higher education is a reproduction of class stratification over time. The really amazing thing, though, about California's public higher education system is that it is a crazy good exception to these rules of thumb. No matter how you cut the data, California colleges just crush almost everybody else on measures of schools that move families and individuals from lower to higher incomes over time and from one class level to another over time. And so I think all of that is to say that I was super lucky to be in a state that provided me with several pathways to a degree, and that was willing to partly subsidize the cost of giving me a world-class education. And for me, higher education started right here at Bakersfield College. It was an important and super crucial entry into that process of producing a trained workforce. And so I think there's an important issue here that's going to end up having some ties to the philosophy I'm going to talk a little bit about in just a moment, which is roughly this: being able to do certain kinds of things, and maybe even being able to be a certain kind of person, depends on the world being built in certain sorts of ways. And I think there is a kind of distinctive feature about how California is set up that enables that to happen. Okay, so I promised I was going to do a little bit of philosophy, so let's see if I can do a little philosophy here without going too long. So here's your mini lecture on a very brief moment in the history of Mexican philosophy. Quick aside, some of you may be wondering, what the heck is philosophy? Like, I've never taken a philosophy class before. Give me a little bit about philosophy. So, one short answer is philosophy is an attempt to think through foundational questions like about the nature of the true, the good, and the beautiful, or it's an attempt to get at probable truths in domains in which we lack widely agreed upon and reliable methods for figuring out what the truth is. So philosophy, in other words, is what we do when we think there's probably an answer out there to one or another, the kinds of questions we're interested in, but we don't really know how to solve it. And so philosophy is what we call this messy, messy bit of problem solving that is oftentimes about some of the most foundational or important questions that we face. How ought we to live? What's the nature of knowledge? Do we have free will? If so, what is it? These are the kinds of questions that philosophers worry about. Okay, so Mexican philosophy. So for my purposes, I'm going to talk about Mexican philosophy. It's just philosophy that's been produced in Mexico in some way, shape, or form. And it's been around for a long time. People have been thinking about philosophical issues in Mexico, or what we now call Mexico, for centuries. And it turned out the answer I should have given if I had known more to my graduate school director of graduate studies was, of course, there's philosophy in Spanish. There's philosophy in lots of different languages. And let me tell you about it. But I didn't know that at the time. And so part of what me and a group of friends are up to is we're trying to change it so that change the shape of academic philosophy so that people can go into the directors of graduate study and say, no, there is a thing here that we want to study, and here's what it's about. Okay, so a little bit about this one moment in the history of Mexican philosophy, existentialism and lo mexicano, and here lo mexicano is that which is Mexican or Mexicanness, and so okay, so here's the idea. So in the mid 20th century, there was a group of philosophers in Mexico who were inspired by a number of figures. Some had been figures in Mexico, and some were figures that came out of the Spanish tradition in Spain, and who came over to Mexico City during the Spanish Civil War, and who began to really take up this question about whether and how people are the way they are in light of the kinds of social and historical circumstances that they're in. And so a group of philosophers, Leopoldo Sea, Emilio Uranga, Portilla, and Rosario Castellanos, these are the photos there on the bottom register. These are folks who were in and around Mexico at that time, and those first three were members of a group that called themselves the Hyperion Group, who were interested in this question about trying to say something about the nature of Mexican being, or the nature of Mexicanness. And part of why they were interested in this question was against the backdrop of a country that had gone through a revolution a few decades earlier, and for which there was a sense that this country, there was something distinctive about it that needed to be articulated, and it needed to be articulated in part if you were going to try to understand what improvement or transformation of that society would look like. So the thought is we've got to understand ourselves so that we're in a better position to try to make improvements or endorse the parts that are really appealing. Okay, so that was the general project of the Mexican existentialists. But I want to talk in particular about this one figure, Jorge Portilla, who had this very interesting project in a number of different ways. And so one of the questions that Portilla was interested in is this question about how does the social world shape what it is that you can do and how you understand yourself. So all of us are individuals, but we always live in a social world, and that social world is set up in ways that make it easier and harder for us to understand certain things about ourselves, and make it easier and harder for us to be and to act in particular kinds of ways. And one of the things that he was interested in was the idea that national differences are oftentimes differences in how societies support what he thinks of as the meaning of public actions. So one way to put it is there's a set of things that you can do that your society is going to enable you to do that another society might not enable you to do, depending on how things are going to be set up. I'm going to give you some examples here. So one of the examples that Portilla talks about is the case of voting. So the experience of voting in a country that takes voting very seriously is going to look very different than voting in a country in which, in fact, there's just only one party operating, and that votes and the outcome of, quote, elections turns out to be detached from any of the preferences that are expressed by voters. And so Portilla's example is, in Mexico, at the time at which he was writing, was government by a single party state, what American political scientists sometimes called the perfect dictatorship. that Mexico was a place where there was you were required to vote and people could vote, but the significance of the vote, as Portilla notes, looks very different there than it looks in other places, in part because you learn that your vote is just part of a charade. You're just doing a thing that doesn't have any real impact on what ends up happening, and that these things are decided at a level that's very different than the level of the voters. And in contrast, in another country where people do take voting seriously, and where how the vote goes affects what the government is and who's in the government and how things operate, people experience the voting and the significance of their voting in a very different way. And so that kind of thing, Portilla thinks, is a case where the structure of the social world affects how people think about themselves and think about what kinds of things they do. Okay, so, sorry here. Give me a moment to catch back up. Tech failure. This sort of thing, I guess, is inevitable in higher education everywhere. So part of what Portilla was interested in was diagnosing how the social world in Mexico helps create a certain kind of experience and dispositions to act. Right. So his thought is maybe the social world is set up in a certain kind of way. It will create a certain kind of agent, a certain kind of person, and in particular, the Mexican person. That's the idea. So the crucial idea for Portilla here is the idea of horizons. So his thought goes something like this: the Mexican experience, what it is to experience things in the Mexican way, what Mexicanness consists in, Mexican being, is partly structured by a collection of horizons. That is, social meanings that are often tacit and unreflectively held. So if you go to visit someplace very different than where you grew up, oftentimes people take different kinds of things for granted. They interact and seem disposed to respond to the world in different kinds of ways. And for Portilla, that kind of difference is partly about the way in which the social meanings of actions are understood in that society. And so he thinks the Mexican experience is structured by a collection of these horizons. And so social arrangements can support and undermine which horizons there are in a nation. That is, they can support different patterns of social meanings. And in Mexico, Portilla thinks, and this is, again, he's writing in mid-20th century Mexico, when you act, sometimes those actions produce responses where the social world confirms or disconfirms what it is that you did. So think about the voting case. You vote, but then it turns out your vote has nothing to do with how the outcome of the election goes. You don't get an echo or response or confirmation that your act meant what it did in a country where voting has no connection whatsoever with the outcome of elections. And so Portilla thinks echoes can be distorted enough to shape a form of agency where norms and meanings and values can't be taken for granted. So if the social world is sufficiently messed up, it's unpredictable what your action is going to mean. It's unpredictable whether or not the thing you're doing is legal or illegal or is committed in this way or not, and where the meaning's constantly subject to uncertainty and negotiation, how people will understand what it is that you did. If that's not stabilized, then you end up with a kind of person that feels like they can't take certain kinds of meanings and values for granted. Okay, so partly then what these horizons do, that is these stable social meanings, is they allow us to make sense of what we're doing. You can understand what you're doing in voting, partly by way of confirmation about how the voting happens. And they allow us to live collectively together. So, you know, and I know that if I'm driving on the wrong side of the road, I'm not responding and behaving in the world in a way that's predictable and confirms our collective understanding about how it is that we drive cars locally. And so part of the thought here is that when those confirmatory echoes that I was just talking about are distorted or unreliable, then it becomes really hard for us to have social cooperation and planning in a stable and extended way. So here are a couple of cases where that echo failure occurs, and for Portilla, this is kind of important signals about a certain kind of instability in the social world. So one is the case of la mordida, or bribery cases. So if you've spent much time traveling in Mexico, maybe you ran into a corrupt official who might have demanded that you pay a fine or pay a bribery, or you engage in bribery, and this sort of thing comes at uncertainty about how the legal world is structured. He also thinks in the marketplace, that is in financial exchange, there's instability, there's haggling, there's arguing over the prices of things. So again, prices aren't predictable. So the law isn't predictable, prices aren't predictable, and family life, he thinks, ends up not being predictable. So the kind of, at the time, widespread practice of having a secondary family, of having mistresses, he thinks meant that we have these three spheres, the sphere of the legal, the economic, and the domestic, that are made unstable by the arrangement of social practices in Mexico. And one consequence of that is that you end up with people who can't take for granted how the world is put together in some of the most important domains of their life, with respect to the law, with respect to economics, and with respect to domestic life. And so that's the kind of Portillan diagnosis. And I think there are lots of things that we could ask about. I'm not going to focus a lot of time on these kinds of things, but I put them up here as questions for you to think about whether or not it makes sense to think of there being a unified experience of Mexicanness, or whether or not how we would go about characterizing that set of experiences, and how to do a story or tell a story about the construction of the social world, whether or not philosophy is the right tool for doing that. And of course, one of the things that Portilla doesn't much talk about is how race, class, gender interact with the story. And so you might wonder a little bit about some of those kinds of things. So here's a thought then about what we might learn from Portilla. I'm going to wrap up here now in just a moment. So one of the things I think we learn from Portilla is that it matters whether or not you have functioning social institutions. So if you don't have confidence in police conduct, then the nature of the law and breaking the law becomes uncertain. If you don't have confidence in how the voting works, or you undermine the success of the independence of the voting institution, then you lose confidence in those kinds of things, and so on, for all of the examples that he gives. And functioning social institutions make it possible to organize your life in particular ways. That is, if you can have confidence that the legal regime is set up in a way, or economic regimes are set up in a particular way, then you can have confidence about how you move through those spaces and what kinds of decisions you're making. But if they aren't set up in stable, predictable ways, then all bets are off. One case that Portilla doesn't talk about, but I think it's really interesting, is the case of higher education. So that is, do we have a world in which higher education is set up in predictable ways that allow people to trust that they're going to have opportunities to ensure for themselves and their children an opportunity to get an excellent education? And I think this is an interesting kind of place. And this is one of the places where I think BC ends up being a really important part of that story about ensuring that we have, and we've got to do our part to support higher education, but to ensure that there are pathways to the goods that are distinctively offered by higher education. So basic upshot: value and protect your higher education institutions. They're part of the things that make it possible for people to live and organize their lives in valuable and distinctive sorts of ways. Okay, now some of you may be thinking, look, I'm here for the free will. You were supposed to promise me something. You promised me something about free will, and you've said nothing about free will so far. And you got to the end of your mini lecture on Mexican philosophy, and where's the free will? Well, here's the story. We'll get to it. This will be the last thing I say. So a few years ago, after I had started regularly teaching a Mexican philosophy class at UC San Diego, I was visiting my parents here in Bakersfield. And I noticed that they had a couple of books on the bookshelf that I had used for teaching Mexican philosophy. And so, and one of them was Leon Portilla's Aztec Thought and Culture, and Patrick Romanel's Making of the Mexican Mind. And so I asked my father why he had copies of these books on his bookshelf. And he looked at me really puzzled. So there's the Leon Portilla book. He looked at me really puzzled. And he said he got them when he was teaching Mexican philosophy. Now, I was completely confused when he said this. My father, so far as I had known, had been a social worker. He worked at Kern Regional Center, helping to coordinate services for the developmentally disabled. And I was having a really tough time trying to understand what this connection was to Mexican philosophy. And he said, well, look, it was all Jess Nieto's fault. Jess is the person, again, for whom this conference is named. And he was starting this Chicano Studies program at Bakersfield College. And he and my father were friends. They'd met at this radio station. And Jess asked my father if my father would be willing to teach a class on Mexican philosophy. Now, one thing to know here is that philosophy tends to be part of the high school curriculum in Mexico. And my father had taken some philosophy in college. So he agreed to teach a class in the evenings after he got home from work. And he did this when I was very young. I had no idea. I asked him why he stopped teaching it. And he said that he knew he had to stop teaching this class, because this was on top of his regular 9-to-5 job, when he saw that I was trying to get his attention by imitating his class preparations, acting like I was highlighting texts. Apparently I was taking a highlighter to the text. And So I opened up the other book that was sitting on the shelf. Actually, so incidentally, here's the syllabus, and there's my father's name on the syllabus for this 1975 Mexican philosophy class, Manuel Vargas. And so anyway, so I grabbed the other book off the shelf, and I opened that book, and that's what I saw. The inside cover, highlight written just as my father had said, the making of the Mexican mind. So I don't know what the moral of that story is, whether it was fate or free will, but maybe this is as good a moral as I can give you. Make friends with people who are trying to make the world a better place. Hope that they push you to try out new and challenging things. And if you don't see what you want in the world, go out and try to make it with the best team of folks that you can find. And sometimes you'll succeed, and generations later, we'll be walking in your footsteps. Thanks so much.
Wow, thank you, Professor Vargas. That was wonderful. And thank you for ending with that photograph. I had seen that photograph before, but not made the connection of that being your father. Before we dive into the Q&A, can I just ask a quick question about that photograph? So was your dad teaching that course on Mexican philosophy? Was that on the radio or how, because you mentioned he was working on the radio. Could you clarify that?
Yeah, so my father was, as young parents are sometimes prone to doing, that you're taking 3 jobs to be able to put food on the table and make sure there's a roof over everybody's head. And so he was working at a radio station in the evenings. And I think my understanding is Jess was a guest on the radio program. And then that's how they met. And then later on, when Jess got involved in starting up the Chicano Studies thing, then I think he subsequently recruited my father to teach the class, and he was teaching it in the evenings at BC.
Do you know were they using the radio though? I'm just curious as a way of
I don't think they were
Not
using
sure.
the radio to be teaching the class. And I think, yeah, and they went on, they had a couple of different classes. They eventually ended up doing some music stuff, but I don't think the radio was where they were using some of those kinds that the radio wasn't the location where they were doing the philosophy.
Okay, I was just curious. Thank you so much for that. So we have some questions in the Q&A. You might want to take a look at those. I know we do have a BC philosopher who said he may or may not come on to ask a question live. I wanted to lead though with a question that had come up in the chat and connect it to something that you had brought up. You know, I think it's wonderful, right, that you have this connection to BC and that you're at the UC. And so I'm really curious in what you were saying about the sort of like the superiority, right, of the California model, particularly, you know, having been across the country at multiple institutions. So, you know, you might have seen, was it last week, this job advertisement at UCLA within chemistry about the free labor. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about, you know, when you talk about California modeling in higher education with a sort of adjunct crisis, because one of the comments that had come up in the chat was, there was a former adjunct instructor at BC who was just sort of, you know, making a remark that, you know, they don't get paid as adjuncts to even have office hours to meet with students. And so I'm just kind of curious, like, what's the view, you know, from the UC, from your perspective on that crisis when you think about this idea, like you said, of a kind of superiority of a California model?
Yeah, good. So I think, so I don't want to give the impression that I think that the California model is free of problems. We have some really deep and serious problems, including the as it were, the adjunctification of higher education. But I don't think that's unique to California. I mean, I think this is just a problem all across the United States right now. And it's not a problem that is unique to California, but it is a problem that we nevertheless have and face and need to take more serious steps about. Now, I mean, there are different ways to think about what's going on, but I take it that the basic core, the core economic pressure on this front is it's just really expensive to do higher education, and you can make higher education cheaper by refusing to pay people adequately to do the teaching, and by not hiring tenure track positions. So the kind of thing that everybody agrees on is that it would be preferable to have more tenure track positions and fewer people in adjunct positions. And if you could turn some of the folks who are in adjunct positions into tenure line positions, that would be great. But it's super expensive to have tenure track positions. And so, and this is, I think, you know, this is one of the places where voters matter and priority of voters matter. So if you have a choice between building another prison or building another university or having more full-time faculty, These are choices that we as communities make in one way, shape, or form, and oftentimes it's through our elected officials and so on. But there are multiple and obviously very complicated economic forces at work here. But I think that's the short version of it. Is I think, yeah, this is a deep problem. It's a problem that doesn't benefit anyone. So students, students can get really solid educations from adjunct faculty, but adjunct faculty are in various ways prevented from delivering the kinds of education that they would love to be able to deliver, in part because they're running all over the place, having to go to sometimes multiple campuses to do their teaching, but also don't have support on the campuses that they're on. And one of the ways in which I think this was something that came up in the chat is, not being compensated, not having a space to even meet with students. And a super crucial part, as everybody who's been through higher education knows, the super crucial part of higher education is oftentimes forming connections with faculty members, with your teachers, and being able to do the deep dive on the questions that you're interested in. And if that's not available to students, students aren't getting part of what they're paying for.
No, I appreciate that response. Thank you. Before we jump into the Q&A, I wanted to ask one other question that sort of came up. You talked about your educational pathway and sort of when you were exposed to philosophy proper, right, in sort of high school, right? And then it comes back to your dad's teaching. To me, as I think about the humanities, philosophy does seem like it's sort of like a ladder tier thing that folks learn, I guess, coming up through the educational system. So my question is, and I think this came up in the chat or somewhere, when you think about demographics, right, in California, particularly like the browning of California, if you will, what are some strategies? I mean, are there examples that you're seeing of like teaching philosophy to younger children, providing this kind of a deeper dive, if you will, to young people? We have a faculty member at CSU Bakersfield, for example, who does this wonderful public philosophy program for children like 5 to 7. So I'm just kind of curious, what your thoughts are about, being able to teach, I don't know, culturally responsive philosophy, if you will, to folks at a younger age.
Yeah, so I guess I think there's no one way to skin the cat, as it were, about how you get people started thinking about philosophy at an early age. But I do think kids are natural philosophers. I mean, there's a way in which the ideal philosopher is a 4-year-old, is somebody who is disposed to ask the question why, no matter what response you get. And I do think, as I sometimes jokingly tell my students, that part of what we're trying to do in my philosophy classes is to turn them back into their 4-year-old selves, except try to get better answers than the ones that eventually stop at 4-year-old. And so I do think that's a natural place to look. And I think there are really interesting ways of doing this. So Amy Reed Sandoval, she's a philosopher at UNLV, who has done a number of the kind of philosophy with children along the border, and is very kind of interested in trying to get folks on both sides of the border to be doing philosophy at a relatively young age, and in ways that is kind of, as it were, embedded in the communities. So it's not some alien force, as it were, coming in from the outside. So I think this is one place to look, one place to start, and I think it's probably good for philosophers if it turns out that as a field we get folded into education at much earlier stages than the current model, where the first time anybody comes across philosophy is in college, and only if you're lucky enough to be at a college that either has a philosophy department or that requires philosophy. Because I think a lot of people in higher education in the United States go through college without ever having an exposure. So I think you're right to kind of wonder whether or not one place to do this is to start earlier.
Oh, thank you. Let's jump into some of these questions in the Q&A. I think there was, let's see here. I don't know if you want to pull them up as well, you're welcome to, but I have one here. It says, which authors are on your Latin American philosophy syllabus? Are there any in particular that you would recommend for a 100 or 200 level philosophy class?
So let's see. So what can I say about this? I was going to say you could just go to my course website, but now everything is now gated behind our learning management software companies. So that's a little harder to answer right off the bat about just go look at the syllabus. But so it partly depends on what you're teaching in your class. So one of the things I like teaching is some work by this philosopher, Luis Villoro, who's very interested in thinking about the conquest of the Americas and the difficulty of, as it were, cross-cultural intelligibility. The difficulty of understanding what the position is of the indigenous peoples and what kinds of the kind of rationality of their commitments in some way, shape, or form. So I think that's a really kind of interesting for people who are thinking about questions in epistemology and how do we wrestle with radical difference. And of course, in a world that is as politically riven as ours is, I think it's a very natural kind of gripping set of questions about what's involved in really taking seriously people whose beliefs are radically different than your own. So that's one piece I sometimes use. Partly related to this, the Las Casas de Pulver debate, I think is super interesting. It's about the justifications for conquest and war. There are works that you can teach that have to do with kind of feminism and the rights of education. So Juan Inés de la Cruz is really interesting on education and the kind of social construction of abilities. So there are a lot of different figures. One of the things that I would recommend for folks who are interested in this is there's at least two books that you should totally go out and get. So one is the 20th Century Mexican Philosophy book that was put together by Sanchez and Sanchez. And the other book is let's see, I may have it right here, Latin American and Latinx Philosophy. It was edited by Robert Sanchez, which provides a kind of a wonderful overview of some of the kinds of major figures and moments. And so I think, in many ways, we're right now in the golden era of being able to do these kinds of things, that we now have translations and volumes and so on. And so I'd start there.
Wonderful. Here's a question from Christopher, I think Minner, I think. Says, how wonderful, Dr. Vargas. Thank you so much for sharing your inspiring story with us for young scholars of BC today. What is the single best piece of advice you can give on finding a path to success? Also, what role, if any, has tequila played in your educational and professional journey? That's a great question.
Yeah, so let's see. So this is it's a complicated question. So let me take the first part first. So my recommendation is, for success, I guess, is a two-part recommendation. So one is, first, identify some mentors. Identify some mentors who can show you the path forward. And sometimes your mentors are not people who you would imagine them to be. And sometimes you learn that they were your mentors after the fact. But try to seek out people who have done the kinds of things you would like to do. And when those people don't exist, become the person or pursue the project that you want to have exist. And I think this is oftentimes the world comes to us already structured, but I really think, and this was partly my experience on the kind of Latin American philosophy front, was that if I sat around waiting for somebody else to do it, I was never going to have a teacher who taught me Latin American philosophy, because they just didn't exist in research universities at that time. And so it was a matter of going out and trying to kind of talk to the people who were already doing the work in different kinds of places. And I'm slightly exaggerating that there wasn't anyone there, but there were some people there, and you had to go out and find them and interact with them. But I think in some sense you have to kind of build the world that you want to live into, and so that would be the crucial piece. On the tequila front, well, I think it goes something like this. I'll say only this about the tequila point. If you love tequila, you really should go to Mexico, and if you're going to be in Mexico, you better learn the philosophy. But good times and friends are always a source of support. In no way would I want to suggest that tequila shouldn't be a part of that experience.
Oh, I like that response. Here's a question from our colleague in philosophy, Brian Russell. He says, as a grad student studying free will, I loved the Garden of Forking Paths and Flickers of Freedom blogs, and I was sad to see that Flickers of Freedom has shut down. How valuable were those blogs for your research? Should more efforts be made to create those sorts of places? Has anything taken the place of those blogs in the free will community?
Yeah, great. So there were a number of years. I guess this would have been in the kind of early in the 2000s, maybe. There were these two blogs that were academic blogs that were run by people who were academics thinking about free will and moral responsibility. And part of what there was a kind of, it felt like in retrospect, a magical moment, but it was a magical moment for blogs everywhere. That is, there were lots of people who were really kind of thoughtful and were using blogs as a kind of space to come together to talk, oftentimes in considerable detail, about the subject matters of their interest. And the free will community was one of the early ones onto academic blogs, and had these really kind of great discussions there for many years. But it eventually went the way of being destroyed as many things have been by other tech forces out there at work. And I think in particular, the rise of Facebook had consequences for where academic discussions were happening. So more and more those kinds of conversations moved online into places like Facebook, or in a really kind of vitiated form onto places like Twitter. And so a lot of that fora just disappeared. And so people then had those conversations either at conferences or in Facebook, but I don't think either of those quite sustained the kind of distinctive sorts of things we saw in the blog world. But I think it's actually going to be very difficult to turn back the clock on that. I mean, in some sense, people got their outlets in other places, and I think it would be wonderful if that came back. But it feels a little bit like that it was an artifact of the time period before the digital world reshaped how people approach these things.
Well, thank you for that response. Here's a question from Brandon Nieto. Going back to the philosophy, is the question of free will the main thing you focus on, or are you also interested in other philosophy questions, like, say, the problem of the mind or consciousness?
Yeah, so I guess I think of myself as working in a cluster of different areas. So I do think a fair amount about free will. I think a fair amount about moral responsibility, which is linked but a distinct topic. I write a little bit about questions about kind of Latino, Latina, Latinx identity, and I do, of course, some work in the history of philosophy in Mexico. And these things are connected in various ways, but I think of them as mostly independent subject matters. But there are, of course, a ton of other questions in philosophy. And one of the things that the more time I've spent in philosophy, the more convinced I've become that I really don't know anything at all. And so when I look at other topics in philosophy, it's always with a tremendous amount of respect and fear for what it is that people who specialize in those areas are grappling with. And so I do think there is some sense in which part of what I love about being a philosopher is that whatever it is you get interested in, there are philosophical questions out there to pursue about it. But also I want to have a tremendous amount of respect for folks who are doing the hard work, trying to figure out what to think about those things. And I think, yeah, that stuff is super interesting, super interested in it. But there's only so much time and you can only do so many different things at once.
Okay, thank you. Going back to Brian, he had another question here, and forgive me if I butcher your question, Brian. He says, how do the results of Namias, I believe is the philosopher's name, and colleagues' experiments on the folks' intuitions on compatibility of moral responsibility and determinism, so long as it is not conflated with fatalism or mechanism, inform your view of the folk conception of free will? If they do not, then why not?
Yeah, so this question is pointing to an issue that has been kind of bubbling around in the background of discussions about free will and moral responsibility. So one of the kinds of things that philosophers who think about free will have sometimes disagreed about or fought about is the question about what's the ordinary sense of free will. And notice here that you could imagine so notice that kind of interesting, and I don't know if this is a parallel or an analogy or disanalogy here, but go over to physics for a moment. It would be really weird for physicists to think that the way we're going to settle questions about the nature of physics is by surveying people's opinions and asking them how do they think physics works. But part of the reason why that seems like a bizarre thing for us to do in the case of physics is because we have all these independent ways of getting at physical features about the world that don't go through people's opinions. When we go over to the free will problem, it's much less clear how we would be able to think and talk and point to free will if it doesn't go through thinking about what concepts people have about it. And so philosophers have sometimes thought that it might be really crucial to an adequate or appealing theory of free will that we go through a story about what it is that the ordinary or folk notion of free will turns out to be. And so some people have thought we can figure this out by doing experimental studies about people's beliefs and see what they can respond to and not. And so I think so the question is partly asking about a body of work by Eddie Namias and his collaborators that has argued that it turns out the everyday notion of free will we have is not one that is in conflict with determinism or a construction of the world under which everything is causally necessitated. I mean, these are technical terms for which, just bear with me here for a moment, but we'll just use determinism as a placeholder for a moment. Okay, so the question is, some of these results look like we might get what it gets called compatibilist answers, or agreements between compatibilism, or sorry, agreements that people can have free will even if determinism is true. So I'm skeptical that this is a widespread phenomenon, and so in response to the question that's getting asked here, I'll just briefly gesture two things. So one is that even amongst the nomiest data, you're still seeing a split in the populations. That is, some people answer in compatibilist ways and some people answer in incompatibilist ways. That is, some people think free will is compatible with determinism, sometimes they don't think that. And that seems to be an important feature all by itself. But secondly, I think it's actually just really difficult to draw conclusions from the empirical data because it's a matter of ongoing research. And one of the things that we're finding, so a colleague of mine, Dan Elkin, who's doing work with psychologists studying some of these kinds of things, has found, is that it actually turns out to be really hard to do empirical research on populations about philosophical questions, because it turns out people, if they don't like the philosophical presumptions getting baked into the question, they just reject it. And they don't tell you that they reject it. And so you can do these kind of interesting studies where it just turns out people resist the presumptions getting baked into the questions. And this is one of the things that makes it really hard to draw kind of big generalizations out of limited data sets about what's going on. And I think that's kind of where we are. It feels like we're still pretty early days. And I'm less optimistic that we can get what we want out of empirical data in the way in which I thought maybe like 10 years ago or so.
Thanks. Just a couple more questions. One came in from Diego Nieto. Any thought to how students find their passion? General academic curiosity, or is it just a matter of luck?
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of both. So sometimes it'll turn out that there is a teacher who gets you excited about something that you never would have been excited about otherwise, absent that particular teacher's energy or enthusiasm for subject matter. And then you can come to, over time, get really interested in that subject matter because you got pulled in. And then once you begin to see how things hang together, what the puzzles are, you begin to get really interesting, get really, genuine interest grows in the wake of it. Interest can be infectious. So I think that's one way. But I also think there are other cases where people just have certain ways they look at the world or certain kinds of things they're really motivated by. I mean, so one thing we sometimes joke about in philosophy is that people don't choose philosophy, philosophy chooses them. That is, it turns out they've got a certain kind of instinct or turn of mind in which when they stumble into a philosophy class, they're like, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for all along. And I didn't know it had a name, and I didn't know this was a thing we could do. And I don't think everybody has that experience in philosophy, but I do think some people do. And I think some people have that version in a wide range of different disciplines, where it just turns out, that your particular flavor, the one that you really like, that chocolate ice cream flavor, that's the one that appears for you, whether it's in sociology or physics or mathematics or communications or whatever.
All right. Well, I'm going to have one last question because I want to, respect your time. But this question is sort of a two-part question. It says, can you speak to the value and the importance for community colleges such as BC to teach classes like Mexican and Chicanx philosophy, considering that, so many students in the area is made up of that demographic? And then the second part is, what are some of the issues or questions pertaining to Latinos in the US that your students are most interested in now?
Yeah. So obviously I love Mexican philosophy. I've spent the past 5 years of my life trying to get UCSD to be caught up with where Bakersfield College was in 1975 with Mexican philosophy. And so I care a lot about it. I'm very passionate about it. I think it's super interesting and it really resonates with my students. So I find my students in my Mexican philosophy class, my Latinx philosophy class, or Latin American philosophy classes at UCSD, they are passionate and care about this subject matter in a way that is just not true of the other philosophy classes I teach. And I'm the same guy teaching both of these classes. And it's like, but there's something special, kind of almost magical that happens in these classes. And I get students coming into office hours, spilled out of the office during office hours for those classes in a way that never happens when I teach the theory of moral responsibility or I teach a free will class or something like that. And I mean, it's not that people don't like those subject matters too, but there's something about the kinds of questions that come up in Mexican philosophy classes or Latin American philosophy classes that the students find really gripping, because oftentimes they're responsive to concrete features about the world, and their attempts to try to think through things that are ultimately have a relatively concrete grounding. And so I guess I think at the same time, every college has finite resources. Every hiring decision comes at the cost of a different kind of hiring decision you could have made. And I don't want to tell everybody how to run their own colleges and how to run their own departments. And I think it's really important for folks to take a look at what resources they have, what they can do, and to try to deliver education as they best see fit to the students they have available to them. But my guess is, Bakersfield College has had success with Mexican philosophy before. It has a distinguished history of teaching Mexican philosophy. And my bet is it would be well received if an opportunity to do that came forward again at some point in time. So, I'd be delighted to see that happen. On the second question, remind me what the second question was.
The kind of questions, I guess, that your students are interested in, that you see at UC, particularly if it relates to Latino populations or Latinos in the U.S.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so one of the kinds of questions that emerges, and I think, we're at UCSD, we're right there on the border. And so a lot of questions related to the border come up. So questions about immigration, the propriety of immigration enforcement, what to think about undocumented persons, whether or not enforcement regimes around these kinds of things are justifiable or not, the kind of seriousness with which borders exist. So lots of questions around immigration are super salient to, I think, to a lot of folks in the San Diego region. Another set of questions that crops up and matters for a lot of my students have to do with questions about what we might think of as kind of broadly how to think about social identity groups. So a lot of people will self-identify as Mexican or as Latino, Latina, Latinx, Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx. And so, and then the question is, what does that mean? Like, what do these categories pick out? And on what basis do we have these categories? So one of my favorite things that one of my students ever told me after a Mexican philosophy class at the end of the term, the student came up to me and said something like, look, I took this class because I'm Mexican, and the class said it was about Mexican philosophy. And so that's why I took the class. But I'm walking out of this class and I no longer even know what Mexican means anymore. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic. Philosophy is doing its work. I mean, in the sense that, and I really do think this about philosophy, that part of our job in philosophy is to ensure that students walk out of our classes knowing less than they did when they came in, but understanding things maybe a little more deeply than they had before. And I think a lot of good education is, not all education, but some good education is about unlearning our presumptions and then having a deeper appreciation of how complicated the world is. And I think that's one of the things that some of our students really kind of end up successfully digging in on these kinds of questions.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Vargas, for taking the time to join us here at the 4th annual Jess Nieto conference. Myself, Andrew Bond, Brian Russell will certainly make our recommendations to our humanities director to, once this pandemic has waned, invite you to campus physically and maybe to do a book talk. So we'll hopefully reach out to you soon. I also wanted to let you know, as a former student of Jack Hernandez, they are having he passed away early this year, late last year. And so there's going to be a memorial event on April 1st. It will be recorded, so we'll definitely send that your way. We really appreciate your comments about Jack. But thank you again so much for being here. And I hope everybody can give me like a virtual round of applause. Before we do hang up, I just want to make a plug. A couple of thank yous again. Thank you, Carrie Olson, our transcriber for tonight. Thank you so much for that. Tomorrow, March 30th at 3 p.m., Latinas Unidas at Bakersfield College is going to host a student activist and leadership panel. At 6 p.m. tomorrow, we're going to have a new research on Latinx studies panel, something on the history of Mexican boxing. Lupe Anguiano, who is a notable feminist and Chicana activist, as well as a research scholar from the University of Chicago will be joining us. So that'll be very exciting. On Thursday, March 31st, Cesar Chavez Day, Professor Jose Luis Benavides from CSU Northridge is going to present on his $350,000 National Endowment for the Humanities grant to digitize farm worker movement photography from Delano in the 1960s. And Thursday night at 6 p.m., we're going to be screening a brand new documentary featuring BC students in partnership with BC's Peace Initiative on the history of nonviolence in the San Joaquin Valley. We encourage everybody who's still here to register now for any and all of these sessions. I believe Andrew Bond has just dropped that web link in the chat box. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here. We wish you all a good night. Thank you again, Professor Vargas.